It's 11 o'clock. I'd like to call to order this meeting of the Actuarial Committee of the Texas Pension Review Board. A quorum appears to be present. I want to welcome members of the public, including those of you who are representing public retirement systems and sponsoring governments. Before we call the roll or rolls, I'd like to address a couple of housekeeping items. This meeting is being recorded. An audio recording will be made available after the meeting. If you wish to speak, before you speak, please state your name so we have a record of who is speaking. And now I would ask Ashley Rendon to please call the roll of the committee members.
Chair Keith Greiner.
Here.
Marcia Dush.
Marcia Dush is here.
Stephanie Leiby.
Stephanie Leiby is here.
Thank you. Ashley, do we have any attendees who've registered in anticipation of possibly speaking?
Thanks, Keith. We only had Mr. David Stacy.
Okay. David, are you around?
David Stacy is present. Thank you.
Hello. Good to have you. First order of business, agenda item 4 is minutes from the September 19th and 20th, 2019 meeting. I would entertain a motion to suspend reading of the minutes of that meeting.
So moved.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. Is there discussion? Seeing no discussion, all those in favor, please say aye.
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 Opposed, say nay. It is unanimous. Motion passes. The minutes will not be read. Minutes are approved and circulated. Agenda item 5. Actuarial standard of practice number 4, second exposure draft, and I'd ask the board's staff actuary, Kenny Herbold, to please present. Kenny?
Good morning, members. This is Kenny Herbold, PRB staff actuary. So actuarial standard of practice number 4 is basically the primary ASOP that governs measurement of pension liabilities for pretty much all purposes. So this is going through a fairly heavy revision, which is why we are kind of providing an update as it's going through the process. The second exposure draft was published in December. Comment deadline has been extended to July 31 due to COVID, and there are a number of parties who are working on comments at this point. But there are some interesting changes. We have talked about this in the past because the original exposure draft was introducing a requirement for a market value of liability calculation. That has been, I won't say removed completely, but it has been changed fairly drastically. So basically what we're looking at this point, and I would be surprised if it changes significantly from this point forward, plans are allowed to use any what I call immediate gain cost methods. So previously it was requiring that you use a unit credit measure, but that's changed now. So basically the primary requirement is you have to use a low default risk discount rate. So something like a U.S. Treasury or a corporate bond or public pension bond rate. The conversations that I've seen, a number of plans might simply take their current cost method that they use and use a lower discount rate and express this particular measure as if you were to invest in a lower, low default investments or lower risk investments, this is the result of what would happen. Some other plans may choose to continue with the unit credit or market value of liability calculation. So basically, it's given the plan actuary more leeway in how this calculation is done and how it's communicated. So that's one of the major changes that's likely to come down the pike in this particular exposure. And some of the other ones, they're introducing a defined term for what is a reasonable actuarially determined contribution. So this isn't something that has been required in the past, but going forward, plans are likely to be required to calculate reasonable ADC. And so what they're doing is the ASOP is kind of identifying cost methods that are not, that are acceptable or that would be considered reasonable. The primary one that we might be familiar with that is likely to be excluded is the ultimate entry age normal cost method, which is used by the Houston plans. However, they're not going to be forced to not use that in the law. Anything that's set by law will be, is still acceptable, but they may have to calculate an additional ADC based off of a different cost method to report. Depends on where everything falls and what they will be required. But since their cost method is set by law for their funding, they may not be required to do that. The other thing that it addresses is amortization methods. So it defines what would be considered a reasonable amortization method, and specifically it says that each amortization base must be have payments that fully amortize the base within a reasonable time period or reduce the outstanding balance by a reasonable amount each year. So this is a step towards addressing the concept of negative amortization that we have discussed in the past. And most likely what's going to happen is any ADC that utilizes a rolling amortization period, say something like 30-year rolling, and possibly even a 20-year rolling, may not be considered a reasonable ADC any longer, and so something else would need to be calculated as a benchmark. So it's not requiring plans to contribute on this basis. It's simply saying that for funding valuations, this is likely, you're going to have to calculate a reasonable ADC and present that in your report. So it's similar to the Texas reporting requirement that we have now, which is a rolling 30-year requirement, but a little bit stronger than that particular requirement. In addition, they are requiring identifying if negative amortization is occurring within the ADC and when that is supposed to expected to go away. So essentially, when the ADC is expected to be larger than a normal cost plus interest on the unfunded liability. There are also a couple of additional disclosures that are, I think, worth mentioning. Most plans, this won't affect most Texas plans, but they're going to require gain loss analysis. So pretty much all Texas plans already include that in their reports at this point. The interesting thing, though, that changes on the assumptions is right now, actuaries are essentially silent unless they find one of the assumptions unreasonable. Going forward, they must positively affirm that the assumptions are reasonable. So they have to make a comment on all the assumptions and say, yes, we think that all of these assumptions are reasonable for the purpose of this measurement. So it's a little bit of a shift in the way in which, I guess, the responsibility that's being placed on actuaries in this particular case. There's also enhanced documentation requirements. Essentially, the current requirement says that another qualified actuary could assess the reasonableness of the work. The new documentation requirement says that another qualified actuary could assume the assignment if necessary, which kind of implies that additional documentation will be required to be maintained and potentially communicated in the actuarial communication. From our perspective, this could be helpful because we have had issues in the past where we've requested information and it was identified as being too costly to obtain the additional information. So if it's already being maintained for documentation purposes in accordance with the ASOP, we may be able to get that a little bit easier in the future when we ask for that. And that's pretty much all I've got at this point. I guess I should talk a little bit about timeline. We are in the second exposure draft, barring any major revisions, which typically don't happen following a second exposure draft, but it could. I would expect this to be adopted early in 2021, and the general timing of when these go into effect is 12 months following the adoption date. So most likely we're looking at valuation dates in the middle of 2022 is when these will really start showing up in stuff that we see. I'm happy to take any questions.
Questions for Kenny from the committee? Kenny, thank you. Let's move on to agenda item 6, funding policies received as a result of legislation that was passed in the last Texas legislative session. And I'd like to ask Michelle Cranes, please, to speak to us. Hello, Michelle. Michelle, your mute button is on.
The cardinal sin of Zoom meetings. I've already committed. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members. Michelle Downey Cranes, Deputy Director. I plan this morning to provide a high-level summary of staff's initial analysis of funding policies submitted to the Pension Review Board under Senate Bill 2224. And those were due to the agency by February 1st of this year. As a reminder, the bill required all systems to adopt a policy that details their plan for achieving a funded ratio of 100% or greater. That was really the only requirement with regards to characteristics of the funding policies. And before I jump into our analysis of what we received, we've provided a short table showing compliance. So we've received funding policies from 92 of the 100 plans. There are 8 plans that still have not sent funding policies to us. Of those, 4 have been in contact with staff and let us know that they're aware of the requirement and working on it. The other 4 we've not managed to make contact with, but we'll keep trying, as we always do, to help them get this important requirement fulfilled. This morning in the Joint Committee meeting, we heard a lot of quantitative analysis, and I'm now going to attempt to provide some qualitative analysis of the funding policies. And before I do that, I want to recognize our staff, particularly Ashley Rendon, Mariah Miller, and James King, who spent hours doing the difficult work of analyzing almost 100 very complex documents. And I think we were able to draw some useful comparisons and conclusions from what we've received. I'm going to take this up in reverse order from what's presented in your packet. So sorry to cause folks to jump around, but I'm going to leave page 19 and move to page 33 of the packet. This is our large data table, and I'd like to begin with the 23 plans that are ADC funded. So these are primarily supplemental retirement plans and plans offered by special districts, such as hospital districts and water authorities, river authorities. Most of these plans have long been on the path to full funding through sponsor commitment to paying the full actuarially determined contribution. And they deserve recognition for memorializing those funding structures into their written funding policies. I'd like to mention that many of these plans are well into their original closed amortization periods. If you look at, just as an example, DFW Airport Board, they have 14 years remaining on their original 30-year closed period. I'd also like to scroll down a bit and highlight a TELFRA plan, Denton Fire. They adopted their funding policy in conjunction with their sponsor, the city, in a meet and confer agreement. That of course means that it has more force behind it because it's adopted by both and it's in the form of a formal agreement. And it's designed to ensure payment of the ADC or a greater amount, which I believe they're currently receiving. I'd now like to move to page 31, to the next category of plans that we've called modified ADC structure. That's essentially a contribution structure that's based on an ADC and designed to eliminate unfunded liabilities systematically, even if they don't receive the full ADC every year. Many of these plans use risk-sharing elements in their funding policies to make up for the difference between assumed and actual experience, and to spread those unexpected costs between the sponsor and plan members. Many of these, it should also be noted, have statements included in their policies which do not prohibit negative amortization or strongly discourage it. And this group includes plans that have strong funding policies that were adopted through statute, such as the Houston plans, Galveston Police, and ordinance such as Fort Worth employees. These funding policies do not allow unfunded liabilities to grow infinitely, with key features being the plans and cities being required to step in and take action when the actual contribution strays too far from the ADC. Now to the bulk of our Texas plans on page 20. I'd like to use a table we created for the summary of the summary, if you will. These, of course, are the fixed rate plans, or we've termed them here non-ADC. Most of these have contributions that are a fixed percentage of payroll established in advance through statute or other document. There are 54 plans that fall into this category. These plans nearly all used the tool of ADC benchmarking to compare actual contributions to the ADC on a regular basis, and then use that to initiate changes to contributions or benefits as necessary. This table attempts to organize the types of benchmarks that were used, as they varied quite widely, from completely closed to an open or rolling benchmark approach. And I wanted to take a minute to explain the third category, which states closed with ultimate layered closed benchmark. Those plans essentially are comparing to a benchmark that has a multi-level funding period goal with an initial closed period. And once that base reaches the lower threshold, they begin to layer in future gains and losses. So there were 10 plans that used an approach like that. I wanted to now move to page 26 and show some examples of these types of funding policies, and first explain the shading that we've done by color. And that was something we attempted to do to help group funding policies that were either identical or nearly so, to allow more ease of comparison for ourselves and the members. And I wanted to mention, of course, there are other funding policies that share characteristics to those that are color-coded, but they had large enough differences that in our judgment, we did not find those suitable to be grouped together. So again, the shaded groups are nearly identical policies to one another. In the green, the plan above the green is the first. I'd like to highlight several plans, and that one is San Benito Fire, for developing their funding policy jointly with the city. In their case, the city commission ultimately adopted the policy and the mayor signed it, which certainly showed support for the risk-sharing elements that they included. And to walk through that example, you'll see they've adopted a 30-year layered closed benchmark that they'll compare their actual contribution to. If they receive two valuations showing their actual contribution is greater than, should be less than, greater than 2% over or under, my apologies, their ADC benchmark, this will trigger them to take action. I then want to talk about the following plans: Denison Fire, Sweetwater, and Port Arthur, which also adopted funding policies with direct support from the city. And while they were not officially adopted or signed, we spoke with those plans because it was clear from the content that they had direct support from the city for the risk-sharing components that they included. And what I'm speaking of there is, while other funding policies that used risk-sharing stated that the board would recommend or consider action, these made it explicit that the board and city will take certain actions to bring contributions back in line with the ADC, including splitting contribution increases between the city and members. So I think it bears mentioning that in the end, a funding policy is of course as strong as the commitments made within it. And these plans and sponsors went above and beyond to do so in a manner that is transparent for all stakeholders as to what will happen should certain conditions materialize. Those were the plans that the funding policies that I plan to highlight. Certainly there are a lot more here that I'm happy to talk about or provide specifics on, or I may ask some of our staff that I mentioned earlier to help me with that. But I suppose in summary, I would say we could conclude that our first round of funding policies for fixed rate plans were overall quite strong in their use of ADC benchmarking as the tool, as well as adopting triggers for action. But I'd say they varied in strength with regards to what actions would result and whether those were adopted by the sponsors. I'll stop there and take questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you. I want to thank you and the other members of the PRB staff who worked on this. This was obviously a Herculean effort to put this together. Not only is there a lot of data here, but the manner in which this data could and should be organized is not self-evident. And I think the staff really did an excellent job of grouping this in such a way that makes it appear coherent and cohesive and to bring meaning to it. And I really appreciate all the thought and effort that went into this. And you know, these funding policies remind me of the old expression that if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. I think that many members of the board were like me, frankly, a little surprised to find out that most pension plans in the state did not have a funding policy. And I think that it's something that every pension plan ought to have. And the Pension Review Board recommended that the legislature consider legislation requiring public pension plans in the state to have a funding policy, and the legislature passed that bill. And this is great progress. I think that there's a general agreement among all or most that the one shortcoming in this legislation is that it does not require the involvement of plan sponsors. These pension plans are not islands unto themselves. Governance goes beyond the plan board and the plan staff and includes the plan sponsor. The legislature, city councils, other entities that have governance and oversight of these pension plans. And until and unless all stakeholders, particularly stakeholders with authority to affect the plan, are participating in the development and approval of these funding policies, we're not really going to be where we need to be. I appreciate Michelle pointing out a few examples of cities in which the plan sponsor did participate and buy into it. And the results, I think, speak for themselves. I think it's a much more meaningful and robust funding policy when you've got the plan sponsor signing off on it. And my hope is that before the end of this year, that this board will recommend that the legislature consider amending this statute to require plan sponsors to sign off or somehow participate in the development of these funding policies. And if we can do that, then these funding policies will have even more meaning.
This
yes.
is Marcia Dash.
Yes, Marcia.
Michelle, could I ask you to put up page 20 on the screen?
Yes.
All right. So as Michelle led off this session, she quoted from the law that the funding policy is supposed to detail a plan for achieving a funded ratio that is equal to or greater than 100%. I'd like to point out that the 13 plans in the open/rolling amortization benchmark category, that benchmark never is designed to approach, it approaches, but it never gets to 100% funding. So as far as I'm concerned as an actuary, those 13 plans have not complied with the law in designing, a plan to get to 100% funding. So I think that's going to be an area that I would suggest some further work. And Michelle, are you going to address page 21 of the handout?
I will get there right now and see what it contains.
Okay, thank you.
Before you do, can we go back to Marcia's comment a moment ago? And I would invite Michelle or Kenny to comment on what Marcia said with regard to plans that are using an open or rolling amortization method.
This is Kenny. I mean, I would agree with Marcia that a rolling amortization period is not designed to ever achieve 100% funding. I think a low amortization period of 5 or 10 is much closer. That's that's a point where you're not having negative amortization. But the 30 and 40 year periods, those are definitely ones in which that when we calculate the effective amortization period for our actuarial valuation reports, and if that's your basis for an actual contribution, we would say that you have an infinite amortization period and you're never going to fund the plan. So I would definitely agree. And as I mentioned earlier, the new ASOP coming out is likely to indicate that these types of ADCs are not reasonable.
I don't know if we're slated for action, but I might just suggest that staff consider notifying those plans that we appreciate their development and submittal of the funding policy, but that they might wish to take a look at that aspect of it in order that it comply with state law. Does that sound okay with my fellow committee members?
Yes.
Members, Anumeha Kumar here. Just to make sure staff is clear, we can reach out to these systems and ask them to provide additional clarification, given the next step for staff is after the June board meeting to compile this information and eventually reported to the legislature. So we can reach out to these systems and ask them to clarify with regards to the requirement, which states essentially a plan to target 100% funding. How are they planning to get there?
Sounds good.
Thank you.
Okay. Would we like to move on to Marcia's second question about the page 21?
Okay. Happy to talk a little bit about this table, which is our attempt to illustrate the number of different types of actions that the systems using ADC benchmarking adopted into their funding policies, that if the trigger is hit from comparing with the benchmark, these are actions that would result. And as I mentioned before, they vary widely. I think it's hard to speak in a simple way about them, but to give some examples, if you start right from the top, there are a number of plans that compare the plan's actual contribution rate to the benchmark rate, and then 3 of those state that they will, with the city, develop a plan of action to bring the combined contribution in line with the benchmark. Then 2 state that the board will recommend additional contributions from the sponsor. 12 state that the board will notify the sponsor and the member association, and either 4 of those consider or recommend contribution changes, or in the case of 8 of them, request a meeting with the city to develop a 20-year plan to establish fixed contributions that would achieve 100% funding over a 30-year closed period. And finally, 1 plan stated they would take all appropriate measures to maintain a fiscally responsible fund. So I'm happy to go on, but I think I'll pause there, and Marcia, just say that I think those are examples of how widely those actions varied, from more specific, using stronger language and in conjunction with sponsor, to vague, less clear action steps.
Yeah, I think here's where we go back to Keith's comments about the need to involve plan sponsors, because the first one, with the city develop plan of action, that's quite strong. I think that reflects probably plans that are working with their municipality. But when you go to recommend additional sponsor contribution, that seems to me a fairly weak kind of plan, if in fact they haven't been working with the sponsor. And I would especially like to comment on the 8. I want to be sure I understand this: request a meeting to develop a 20-year plan to achieve 100% funding over 30 years. I'm assuming that's a 50-year plan. Or more than that, because you get a meeting, you develop a plan that maybe starts a few years from now to get to 30-year closed in 20 years. I mean, I don't know, that seems to me to be ridiculous. So, and that 8 plans come up with that same idea, that seems a bit strange to me as well.
Yes, and bear in mind that is the action that takes place after 2 or 3, if they conduct annual evaluations, have shown that the fixed rates were less than the ADC benchmark by more than 2%.
Yeah, again, I mean, this to me defeats the purpose of the legislation. And again, I think it's something that as we go through this process, we really do need to think about what we will be recommending to the legislators in November. And again, a very weak comment: take all appropriate measures to maintain a fiscally responsible fund. That's not a plan. That's a aspiration.
And I'll note, Marcia, that the group of 8 that request the meeting to develop a plan includes 2 systems that we've analyzed through intensive review. And this board has made recommendations that they develop a very strong funding policy in line with their funding soundness restoration plan that would achieve an amortization period in line with PRB guidelines as quickly as possible.
So again, I'm disappointed in what I see here.
Yeah, this is Keith, and I cannot disagree with you, Marcia. There is evidence here of some good progress being made, and there certainly is some evidence that some plans didn't try very hard, honestly. And I recognize that plans, again, are not entities unto themselves. But the idea of developing a 20-year plan to amortize over 30 years is pretty thin. Other questions? Do you have more that you'd like to present, Michelle? Is that your comments?
No, thank you. I'm finished.
Okay. I would encourage the members of the committee to spend time with this. And I think staff is going to be coming back to us with some suggestions for this committee to consider that we might eventually bring to the full board for how to improve and strengthen this policy, this statute, put a little bit more teeth into it that the legislature might consider when it next convenes, starting in January. Again, go ahead.
And I would concur with your suggestion that as those plans that either have the rolling benchmarks or don't provide a benchmark as a trigger for action, that the staff do reach out and try to get some clarification on how they are complying with the law, which requires them to achieve 100% funding.
We will. Thank you.
Okay, once again, I want to thank and commend the staff for your work on this. There's a lot of work and a lot of interesting information, and this is a big, important first step for public pension plans in Texas. And I think on the whole, we have to be pleased with the progress that's been made here. I also want to thank the public pension plans for their work in putting these together and submitting them. I think a real good faith effort was made to put these together and submit them to the board, and we appreciate that. So we are slated for possible action to develop a legislative recommendation to include the plan sponsors in the funding policy requirement to present to the full board at its next meeting in June. And I would entertain a motion to that effect.
So moved.
Seconded.
Okay, so this is a motion that would recommend to the full board that would direct staff to develop a legislative recommendation to include plan sponsors in the funding policy requirement. And this would be presented to the full board at its June meeting. Essentially, I think this would close the loop or take a big step toward closing the loop, bringing in the other primary governance entity in this funding policies, namely city councils and plan sponsors, including the legislature. Comments or questions about this motion? If not, we have a motion, we have a second. All in favor of the motion, please say aye.
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 Aye. Opposed, same sign. It passes unanimously. Thank you very much. On to agenda item 7, review of, review of funding soundness restoration plan requirements under sections 802, 2015, and 2016. Anu.
Anu Meha Kumar. Thank you, Chair Brainerd. Members, as you know, the current funding soundness restoration plan in state law uses a 40-year amortization period threshold to require systems and their plan sponsors to jointly develop a plan designed to achieve a contribution rate sufficient to bring their amortization period under or below 40 years within a decade. Last session, there were a couple of bills that were filed to update this requirement, essentially to bring the threshold more in line with the PRB's funding guidelines. However, those bills died. And you all have expressed interest to essentially consider recommending to the legislature moving forward to update this requirement. This is our initial discussion in possibly considering making that recommendation. And what we have done is included in your meeting packet on page 37, a brief timeline of funding measures that the state has adopted as well as the board has updated. You'll see, of course, the Funding Soundness Restoration Plan with the 40-year threshold was first enacted by the legislature back in 2015. Since then, the Pension Review Board has updated its funding guidelines and lowered the maximum amortization period threshold from 40 years down to 30 with a preferred target range of 10 to 25 years. And in 2019, the legislature passed Senate Bill 2224, requiring systems to adopt a plan to target 100% funded ratio. There is a disconnect, if you will, between what the legislature enacted in 2019 and the Funding Soundness Restoration Plan, which was put into place in 2015. Additionally, in light of the ASOP exposure drafts, the 40-year threshold, it appears, is going to become outdated or not recommended. So we wanted to include this information so the committee can have some initial discussion. And the goal here is, if the committee so wishes, they can direct staff to come back with a more complete report, if you will, for the full board to consider at its June meeting, where we can look at both the policy aspect of the Funding Soundness Restoration Plan with regards to the amortization period threshold or the trigger, as well as more on the implementation side on a staff level, since we've been working on implementing this requirement since 2016. We were also hoping we could address some of the issues that more on a staff level we experience as we work with our plans to help them comply with this requirement. We have included our current updated list of the FSRP plans, essentially showing the plans that are at risk or immediately subject to the requirement. One other thing that I do want to point out, and we will, of course, consider this if the committee so directs staff to put together a report for the June board meeting, is the systems that are immediately subject to, and you can see that on page, if we can further the packet, please, to the FSRP list. Next page, please, page 39. Majority of the plans on this list on page 39 of the meeting packet that are now subject to the FSRP formulation requirement are now subject to a revised FSRP. And so that is another area we would like to look into, given the statute requires them to put together an FSRP, which these systems did. However, they then at their next valuation became subject to a revised FSRP. And our hope or our goal is that if the committee so wishes, again, they can direct staff to put together a more complete report to bring back at the June board meeting.
Anu, I would like to make a comment about the plans listed on this page, and I may have not looked at this correctly, but I believe that all but Midland on that page are also on the list of those 25 plans where we have some concerns on the short-term measures that we discussed this morning. So I think if you're going to be reaching out to those plans about short-term issues, you might be able to get some better information as to what's going on with these plans. Or maybe you're already in contact with these. But again, yeah, I think the problem of plans that are continually in the FSRP line, you know, they create a plan, doesn't work, create a new plan, doesn't work. Aren't some of the plans actually on their third revision?
Correct, Orange Fire is.
Yeah.
And to add to your comment, Marcia, except for Midland Fire, the other 5 on this list, the PRB has conducted an intensive review, has looked at more closely, and made some stronger recommendations for these systems to consider as well.
All right, thank you for correcting me. That was, I made a note and I thought it had to do with the short term, but I'm sure some of these are on the short term issues list as well.
You're right. Keith.
Sorry. Anu, could you please go back to the page where we were before that summarizes the FSRP statutory requirements? That's it. So we identify in there that, let me get that language right there. If a system receives several consecutive actuarial valuations, so I think that's 2 or 3 depending on the frequency of the valuations.
That's correct.
So conceivably a system could take up to 6 years, if my math is correct, between a valuation that identifies that they're not meeting minimum standards and the time that they're actually required to submit an FSRP. Does that sound right?
That's right.
It can be as little as 3 years. I think 3 years is the minimum, as long and as can be as long as to 6 years, which I have always felt is way too long. You could fall into bad actuarial shape and have no requirement to identify a plan for several years, during which time things could get even worse. And I would like to ask the staff to consider tightening that up, so that not as much time passes after the first problematic valuation occurs. I think is very generous. I mean, first of all, we're dealing with 40 years, which we can talk about in a moment. And then on top of that, you can wait several valuations before this requirement is triggered. So I would like to ask staff to recommend either to us or to the full board when we meet in June, something that gets a plan to a required FSRP quicker than 3 to 6 years.
Well, and then Keith, I would go on looking at the next point. Essentially, we're back to these 50-year plans. You know, they are to achieve a 40-year amortization, not later than 10 years from the date of the final version of the FSRP. I mean, again, that's 50 years.
You know the old expression, in the long run, we're all dead. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. 40 years is antiquated, and I think staff already is recommending that we go to 30 years. Is that right, Anu?
That is correct.
PRB funding guidelines recommend top range of 25 years. And I'd like to throw it out for the committee's consideration to lower that 40 instead of lowering it to 30, to lower it to 25 in order to comply with PRB funding guidelines.
Yeah. Because I think at 25, you actually get into positive amortizations for most plans, depending on what salary increase rates they're working with.
Yeah, when you're out at 30 years, it's difficult to make meaningful progress on your amortization. And you know, 30 years, it has some history. That was the number that GASB established when they first established standards for public pension funding guidelines back, you know, about 30 years ago. And they actually started with 40 years, but gave plans 10 years to get down to the 30 years. But we were a much younger workforce as a nation and for the public pension community at that time. And we're not there anymore. We're a much more mature workforce. And I think 30 years is a very long time to extend an amortization period. And I would like to suggest that this committee or the full board consider the trigger for an FSRP to be 25 years rather than 30 years.
Now recognize that is going to put a lot of plans into the FSRP world. I mean, if you go back to Kenny's actuarial report and you look at the amortizations, the current amortization levels, I think, you know, you don't hit 25 years till you're onto the second page. So that's probably 50 plus plans. You know, Anu, I think the way you started off, you were saying you wanted us to charge you and the staff to come back to the board meeting with a recommendation on how to tie all of this together.
That is correct. And we can look at different options to both yours and Keith's point here. The trigger, we can look at the magnitude of the impact can either be 25 or 30, eventually the board decides, as well as a couple of other options in light of the new funding policy requirement as well.
Yeah, and again, there were funding policies that had 30-year fixed or 30-year layered amortizations. So, I mean, to me, that was at least a good step in the right direction. So I don't want to negate the good work that was done there. But again, I think if you can kind of put it all together, you know, looking at these three kind of things that have happened along the way together with what you're seeing on the funding policies, you know, and maybe come together with a couple of options of how we might change the FSRP triggers, that would be good.
We can do that.
This state and the political subdivisions in this state, not all, but many, have been kicking the can down the road for way too long. And we got the results to show it. And just look at the results in the Actuarial Committee report. We've got long funding periods, some infinite, many over 40 years. We've got a lot of plans that are very poorly funded, a lot of plans that are not making their required contributions. I think, honestly, the picture as a whole is abysmal. It is abysmal. And that doesn't even include the results of the last 2 months where we've experienced a market decline and where the state and its political subdivisions are going to be experiencing a revenue decline. And if nobody else in this state is going to stand up and say, it's time to stop kicking the can down the road, it's time that we started paying our bills, it's time that we started being accountable to our public safety workers, our teachers, our other public employees, and to future taxpayers, it is this committee, it's this board, and it needs to happen now. It's been going on for way too long. It's a polite fiction that the plans in this state are doing okay, because as a group, they're not. There are some stellar outliers. Some plans that are very well funded, where plan sponsors have made an effort, a meaningful, good faith effort to fund their plans. Way, way too many plans and plan sponsors. I'm not just blaming the plans. In fact, I think that the plan sponsors deserve the majority of the responsibility in this. Way too many plan sponsors have been lackadaisical about this, have been indifferent to it. If nobody else is going to stand up to this, it has to be this group. It has to be us. And you know what? If 3/4 of the plans in the state end up on a funding soundness restoration plan list, then so be it. Because the consideration is not the number of plans on the list. The consideration ought to be what is sound criteria for funding a pension plan. And we have developed sound criteria for funding a pension plan. It's called the PRB Pension Funding Guidelines. They're right there. So I would like to encourage this committee, to encourage the full board, to encourage the legislature to adopt policies, statutes that stop kicking the can down the road and begin to establish a little bit of accountability. Because if it wasn't obvious before, it ought to be obvious now. We ain't in Kansas anymore. We got some problems and we need to stand up and deal with them.
I support you.
Members, then we do have a motion for this agenda item. And
Okay. Let me read what you gave me, Anu. I would entertain a motion to direct staff to prepare a report on issues concerning the implementation of the FSRP requirement, including the amortization period threshold, to present to the full board for consideration at its June meeting. And I would expand that a little bit to include all factors in this, including consideration of a shorter period of time following the onset of the first valuation, in which a plan does not meet the required criteria, and also a maximum amortization period of less than 30 years. So that is an entertainment for a motion to that effect. And we're not being specific in this. We're asking staff to come back to put some specifics to the general statements that we have discussed here.
So moved.
Second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Is there discussion? Okay, so what will be, what will come out of this after we vote, presumably, is that at the full board meeting in June, staff will provide a recommendation or some recommendations for the full board to consider with regard to recommended changes that the full board would be making to the legislature to public policy regarding fundings, the FSRPs.
And
Is that consistent with your understanding, Anu?
that sounds correct. What I would add here is, since we will be presenting our report to the full board, the board will then have the option to either act on those recommendations that we provide as options, or can also consider then turning it back to the actuarial committee for honing it a little bit more before bringing it back to the full board for a final adoption.
Okay, I think that's good. So the board will have some options, and one of those options would include sending it back to this committee to hone some details.
Correct.
I'm comfortable with that. Is the rest of the committee comfortable with that?
Yes.
So we can have a discussion about it with the full board, and if we can reach a consensus there, presumably we would be able to make our final recommendation to the legislature, and if not, the board would have the discretion to send it back to us to meet out some of the details. Other comments or questions on the motion? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed, same sign. It passes unanimously. Thank you.
Thank you, members.
Next item on the agenda, item 8, date and location of the next actuarial committee meeting. Not yet determined, is that right, Anu?
That is correct.
And perhaps well, I'll leave it up to staff. We might want to wait until the full board is met, and perhaps we might want to develop a date before the full board meets, but sometime after this meeting.
So thank you, Keith. We will poll the members to have some potential dates available, given the committee could certainly have additional work to do, both on the funding soundness restoration plan issue as well as the funding policies. So we will reach out to the members so we have some potential.
Okay. What would you say, Anu, is the time frame for which the PRB needs to make a recommendation to the legislature if it's going to do so?
We currently have an October board meeting date, and the recommendations that the board makes is through the biennial report that we put together end of November. So we usually have a board meeting slated for either end of October, early November, where the board can adopt the recommendations it so wishes to make to the legislature so we can include those in the biennial report at the end.
Okay. So it would be at that meeting that would be the final time when the board would be making its recommendations. And so obviously, if this committee is going to consider other changes, then it would have to be in advance of that.
That's correct.
Okay.
Anu, the board meeting isn't until November 12th. So does that run into a problem with you being able to finalize things for the end of the month?
No, that should still work for us. Thank you.
Okay. Without further ado, invitation for public comment. If there is anyone wishing to address the board, now would be an appropriate time. Please begin by unmuting your phone or your computer. Please try to keep it to 2 or 3 minutes. And please begin by introducing yourself. Is there anyone who wishes to address the board?
Hello, board. This is Kelly. Go ahead, David.
Oh, okay. David Stacy, Midland Fire. Related to the comments Chair Brainerd was making, while I appreciate about Texas paying the bills, I appreciate your passion and drive, and I don't disagree with the principle of your view, or at least how it seems. But the political reality is that, or at least what I'm not hearing in what you're saying, is that plan sponsors or public plans in Texas need to review and figure out a way to sustainably provide a real benefit to their employee groups. I think that would be much better stated. If you're looking simply on an actuarial cost standpoint of how it looks on an ongoing financial basis, the easy cut is we cut benefits. And you end up with a far less meaningful benefit to the employee groups. But on paper, on a sustainable cost basis, it looks good. And it's a political hornet's nest to actively engage in that conversation in Texas. And I'm up for the engagement, don't take me wrong, but I understand fully what the other side of the coin is and what the key battlegrounds are going to be. And I have serious reservation about the PRB making recommendation to the legislature on overall funding, appropriate funding policy in Texas without engaging anything about a meaningful net benefit to the employee groups at the end of the day. And that concludes my comment for now.
Thank you, David. We appreciate your comments, and we appreciate your diligent attention to the proceedings of this board. Is there anyone else who would like to address the board?
Yes, I would. This is Kelly Gottschalk with Dallas Police and Fire Pension System. I would like to just comment on the board comments related to page 21, the ADC benchmarking. I do believe that the PRB staff did an amazing job of taking 100 documents and trying to put those in some sort of order and grouping, but I do hope that when comments are made that certain pieces in a funding policy aren't appropriate, there's more looking into why those specific pieces are there. I'm assuming that my two plans, our regular plan and our supplemental plan, are the two plans that are listed here that say recommended additional sponsor contributions. And there's a good reason for that. I mean, I understand this is a summary, but before that is viewed as negative, I think it's important to understand more information about these complex plans. Number one being the normal cost is below what the employees are already paying. So doing anything on the employee side is probably not reasonable. And there's also a mechanism in place in 2024 to address funding issues. And I have no control over what the city does. So frankly, the only thing I can do at this point is recommend to the sponsor. I can't control what the sponsor does, and I don't think it's appropriate at this time to do anything on the employee side. So just a caution, if anything is going to the legislature in the form of a summary, I would hope that there's more color around why some of these recommendations appear to be weak. Thank you.
Ms. Gottschalk, thank you. I think that is sage advice that we all need to keep in mind to not draw big inferences or conclusions just from excerpts of this, and I appreciate the reminder. Thank you. Is there anyone else who would like to address the board at this time? Going once, going twice. Okay. If there's no further business, no objection, I would move to adjourn the meeting. Would someone like to second that?
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. Thank you. I want to thank the members of the audience, the plan sponsor representatives, the public retirement systems who are in attendance, of course, the staff. Thank you, staff, for your work. And thank you, members of the board, for your service to this state and to this community. And with that, we'll look forward to seeing you all in June.